Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah is going to
the one that forwards the names of people who want to say.
It's the end of the week.
Not the first time he decided to stitch me up there.
It's brand new, very expensive.
Right, so, hi. Trying not to recreate what we were doing with the roleplay thing earlier. My name is Sam Burns, and amongst other things, I'm a voice actor. Now, I was asked to do a talk about voice acting as part of the panels here, and I wondered kind of at first what I was going to specifically talk about, but what I'm going to start with is I'm going to talk about, firstly, obviously what voice acting is and how it does and doesn't differ from other types of acting, and then I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about the actual techniques we employ when we are doing the work. And then later on, if I have time, I'm going to talk about how I do all of this, and also I'm a dyslexic person. So, starting out with voice acting. Now, voice acting takes many, many forms: audiobooks, computer games, documentaries, adverts, podcasts, animation, basically anything in which your physical body is not primarily seen. But there are, of course, exceptions to this. Like a lot of modern computer games also have the voice actors doing the motion capture for stuff, so there are exceptions there. But in a way, it's kind of a false dichotomy, because there is not really a dividing line between acting and voice acting, stage acting and screen acting. It's all the same thing, only the techniques you're employing in order to do the work are slightly different. Like, for example, I'm speaking to all of you now, and I'm raising my voice slightly so I can be heard at the back, and I'm doing this because that's the technique that we have in order to get our point across to the audience, and it's based on where the audience happen to be. Like, for example, if I were to come and sit just next to you and start speaking at this level, it's kind of a little bit off-putting, isn't it? Yeah.
Too loud.
It's all right, I'm partly deaf.
So no harm done there. But the point being is, when you are on stage, you are a set amount of distance away from the audience always. So if you're hitting the people at the back, that's fine. With screen, it's a little bit different. Your audience is basically wherever the camera happens to be. So, likewise, if I'm speaking to this camera over here right now, they're about as far away from me as the rest of the audience are. But, if I'm right up here, I have to be speaking like this. Because otherwise, it seems really, really big and evasive and just off, frankly. And we were talking, I think it was someone who was talking in the panel the other day about how, as humans, we are like super adapted to knowing when something is slightly off. I think it was actually James Burgess talking about like the proportions of a face. Yeah. If they are slightly off, then we don't believe it, or we get kind of weirded out by it. Personally, I think this is a great premise for a horror story, because seemingly, humans have that ability that has been evolved into us for seemingly no good reason. But there must have been one at one point. Anyway, so one of the things about audio specifically is it can be one of the most unforgiving mediums of any kind of media. Because when you don't have visuals or any other form of input, you have to be creating this whole world with just sound. Like, as an example, as a theatre, you might be going to the theatre, you see someone performing on stage, and they maybe drop a line, or they say something that's not quite right, or something goes wrong. But, you know, you've sat down, you paid your 20 quid or whatever, you can look at the costumes, you can look at the scenery, you can basically get your money's worth out of the experience. And likewise with film, Again, if there's a slight mistake or something that takes you out of it for a while, there are other things that sort of tide you over. But with the audio medium, all you have is your voice a lot of the time. And while it is one of the more unforgiving mediums, it's also the one that at the moment now has like the lowest barrier to entry. Like for example, this is the microphone that I recorded a large amount of the Circle of Spears stuff on and other things. I also did many episodes of my podcast on this. It is a Samsung CO1U condenser mic, and it's sort of the workhorse of a typical voice actor. They retail for about somewhere between 70 and 90 quid these days. Now, there's nothing to say that you need to start out on one of those, but generally speaking, it's the one that's sort of most versatile for the sort of job that you're doing a lot of the time. And as such, the audio medium is exploding at the moment. Like I mentioned that I'm part of a podcast. I've been on that for the last 4 years. It's a Dungeons and Dragons actual play podcast. And this leads me actually to something that I know some of you might disagree with me on this, but I tend to think that the idea that as audiences we are getting shorter attention spans is wrong. I think that what we are getting is a very low tolerance for boredom. And I think those two are actually distinct things. And this leads me back to talking about audio being a kind of an unforgiving medium. It's a case of how do you get people's attention and keep it? Now, I was quoted when I was learning audio technique at drama school that if someone is just flipping through TV channels or on the radio, because that was the era in which they were talking about it, that the average amount of time someone will listen to something they weren't actually intending to listen to see if they want to continue listening is between 6 and 12 seconds. Yeah. Now, I think there is a better, more modern example of that. You're all familiar with the website YouTube, right?
Yep.
Well, recently, YouTube started another feature, which is YouTube Shorts. And YouTube Shorts are usually very small videos that are only like about a minute long, and when one finishes, the next one immediately plays. So the actual thing that you're doing, rather than clicking on something you specifically want to watch, is you're making the decision actively to keep watching, rather than to start watching. So, one of the things with audio is that you're trying to make people actively make the decision to keep listening, rather than start listening. One of the other things I was going to say actually about mic technique now. I'll move on to how we actually do this. So, when you are in a studio or by yourself, often the amount of time, you are working entirely on your own. You may have a script, but you may not even have like the author or a director or anyone else there to talk to you. So you have to make decisions as to how you put the piece of text or whatever it is across. You'll be working with a microphone about an arm's length away. Now they say this used to be social distance, like comfortable social distance where like you were talking to someone. COVID has entirely fecked all of that. But basically, for a mic like this, depending on where the levels are, you're probably going to want it at arm's length about that. So if I were sat down, as I often am, but if I'm sat down, it's usually about this far away. I'll have the text up on the screen in front of me, and then I'd be speaking into it like this. Now there's a number of things that you have to know with a condenser mic like this is that the pickup is, they sometimes refer to it as cardioid. So it's kind of heart-shaped. So the pickup kind of comes out from the microphone, around and back in. So you only have about like that much of a window for where you're speaking. So it's difficult to demonstrate this, but when you're speaking into a microphone, you're having to treat that always as your point of focus when you're doing whatever it is you're doing. Regardless of whatever else is going on in the scene, regardless of whatever else is going on in the text, that's your focus. Because if you shift slightly further off, you end up kind of sounding like you're off mic. And being off mic is not what you want, because then it breaks the illusion. Like, for example, one of these things that you have in terms of keeping people's attention and keeping the engagement is keeping the sound and the tone quality consistent. And that's one of the ways that you do it. Another way that you do it is not peaking, whereby you are too loud for what the microphone is picking up. I heard that sound came like this all the time. We've all heard it. You get this on phones a lot. If anyone's ever recorded themselves on a phone and they're just slightly too close to the mic, all the brain kind of registers is loud rather than the actual content of what's being said. That's an important thing as well. Now, generally speaking, one of the things that we look out for when we're doing this is plosives, P's, B's, T's. Often those are the things that will peak a mic if you're not careful. So you have to be careful with phrases like, pass the ball, Patrick, or what have you. But when we're trying to keep the audience engaged, we want to make the words that we're putting across engaging. So we're trying to find a way of always making them interesting and compelling. And we do this in a number of different ways. One of the things, actually, that I should talk about with regards to peaking is if there is a very emotionally fraught scene, obviously our natural inclination is to get louder, to make it more intense. And intensity, not volume, is the important thing here. Like if I pick on someone randomly in the audience, yeah, you didn't know there was going to be audience participation in this one, did you? Okay, I will pick you. Okay, I'm going to give you a line. All I need for you to do is just say that line and mean it as much as you possibly can. Okay, the line I'm going to give you is, I'm angry.
I'm angry.
Okay, mean it more.
Oh dear. I'm very angry.
Okay, you don't need to change the other words, just... Yeah.
I'm angry.
Okay, mean it more.
I'm angry.
Okay, you see how the volume was going up there?
Yeah.
Very good. Love it. But on a recording, sometimes that's a thing that will peak the mic. And again, that's going to break the illusion of what you're doing. You could be acting your heart out, and on stage or on screen that could be perfect, but you've also got to keep in mind of the tools with which you're working. So, a lot of the time when we are playing a scene that requires that kind of level of emotion, you need intensity, not volume. So, say that again, but don't get any louder, mean it more.
I'm angry.
Okay, again.
I'm angry.
All right, mean it more.
Can I just say that when I get angry, I do get louder, my natural reaction.
Yeah.
I find it very hard to pretend to be angry without being loud.
Fair, okay. That's good, but I think we've seen what the example there is that
I might be a voice actor.
no, this is the thing. It's a thing that is very, very counterintuitive. It's a thing that you wouldn't necessarily think would make a difference, but it does. So there's intensity, not volume, that you've got to pay attention to. Also, placing things Like, if you're talking about a list of different things, for example, often you'll see audiobook narrators especially, they'll be gesticulating quite wildly in the booth, doing what they're doing, and it's a way that helps them stay in character, because I don't know if any of you have seen the Batman animated series, or are familiar with it. Well, if you see any footage of Mark Hamill playing the Joker in the booth, you'll see he is up on his feet, his entire body is engaged with the performance, even though obviously only his voice is going to be heard in the final product. So, one of the things that we have to make sure that we do is don't wear any kind of rattly jewellery. You will immediately know a voice actor by the fact that it's pretty much like the first thing that goes. It's also like how they say you'll always know an actor by whether or not they're wearing black socially as to how much they're employed. Well, generally speaking, if you're a theatre actor especially, you've got a whole set of black clothing you only use for rehearsals. So if you're wearing that socially, you're probably not actually as employed as you'd like to be. But I'm going to use an example now, and most of the examples I have for this particular one are Shakespeare. Don't be afraid. But it is just because they're a good example of a technique that's more broadly applicable. So, sometimes when you are dealing with lists of things are a really, really difficult thing to make interesting. Because, again, anyone who has listened to the shipping forecast will know that when they're reading out all of the various different things that they're reading out, it starts to get a little bit soporific, and unless you're really paying attention, it just ends up sounding all like white noise after a while. You know, Viking, north at 0, south at 0, forces 4 or 5, moderate or 4. German bite, watch out for that. Irish sea, Irish stew. But so, when we have lists of things, often one of the techniques we employ is we'll have, if it's a list of 3 especially, you can have the first thing, the second thing, and even the third thing. That's where the emphasis usually falls. Or you have the first thing, the second thing, equal the third thing. So, friends, Romans, countrymen, or friends, Romans, countrymen. There's also a number of other things we tend to look at. We tend to look at, well, numbers. If ever numbers appear in a script, whether it's a documentary or a dramatic or whatever, they're either very, very big or they're very, very small. The emphasis has to be placed on the significance of numbers, because otherwise it's just a random load of numbers that have good context. A thing that I hope I'm getting across here is that making decisions as to how you're going to play everything, or how you're going to deliver everything, is key. If you're working with a director, that's great. They can be the outside ear, so to speak. But a lot of the time, you're not. So it's a technique that you have to develop as a voice actor, to be able to make a decision on the fly about how you're going to put something across. They can come along later and say, actually we didn't like it like that, we'd prefer this. That's fine, but you've got to make a decision. Otherwise, you sound a bit like a newsreader. And again, this is not to bash newsreaders, but they have a different job to us. Their job is to read the news. It's supposed to be objective, believable, what have you. But if you end up just reading along a piece of sentences like this and like that, you eventually end up getting into a rhythm where you don't really get out of it, and there is not really anything that changes the way that you're putting anything across. And you'll notice that with TV news reporters or newsreaders, they are reading off a teleprompter where they only have maybe 1 or 2 sentences that they can actually read at a time, so you never know exactly when they're going to finish, and they will be continuing on and on and on and on, etc. So, how do we avoid that? Well, one of the things that we always tend to look out for in any kind of text that we are presented with are things like distinctions, comparisons, repetitions, numbers I've already talked about, and, well, a good example of having to make a decision to keep the audience engaged is, there's another Shakespeare quote, it's from Antony and Cleopatra this time. She has a big long speech just before, spoiler alert, she dies. Where she laughs and asks her breast, and the speech begins, "Give me my robe, put on my crown, I have immortal longings in me." Now, the first part of that, "Give me my robe, put on my crown," that's instructions. And I don't think it is possible to say those words or give those instructions any more concisely in the English language. The writers of you, welcome to try. But then the second part, "I have immortal longings in me," that's a change. That's a separate thought. So, you can't say, "I have immortal longings in me," in the same way as you said the first part of that sentence. Because otherwise, it sounds weird. It's like, "Make me a cup of tea, I have immortal longings in me." So, yeah, you have to look at how you address the changes in a piece of text. So, the way we, well, some of the ways we do this are distinctions. And this goes back to what I was talking about a little earlier about how sometimes voice actors will place different things in the physical space around them, not because they can be seen, but because by doing that and addressing to those different spaces, it gives the impression of those things being separate and distinct. So you can have this thing over here, and you can have that thing over there. Now, if you're in a non-visual medium, you don't need to worry about all of that, but by doing it, it allows you to get the thing across. Probably most of you will be familiar with the rule of 3 when it comes to oratory, even if it's not something that you were formally taught, because a lot of the time when people are talking about stuff, they will break them into 3s. This is again something that, like I was touching on a moment ago, you can highlight and extenuate. Sorry. Comparisons also. Comparisons in a text are a thing that we always look out for, because those are, again, things that usually have a significance to whatever the character is saying, but it's a thing that is always something worth highlighting. Maybe not literally, we're not all people who use highlighters, but it's a thing that you want to pay attention to. And also repetitions. Now, generally, in life, we don't repeat ourselves unless there is a reason for it. Generally, in life, we don't repeat ourselves unless there is a reason for it. Generally, in life, we don't... Now, usually, we have to work out whenever there is a repetition in a piece of text, why? Why is it there? Is it adding emphasis? Is it adding clarification? Is it there to like really drive home a point, or is it something that tells us something about the character, perhaps? That's usually what we do when we're looking at those sorts of things. I'm going to move on to, in a moment about and talk about being both a voice actor and a dyslexic person, but I'm just double checking what we have for time.
You're fine.
Oh, we're fine. Yeah, great, excellent. Okay, so I'm a voice actor, I'm also a dyslexic person. And you might think at first, well, this is an obvious conflict here, because notably one of the things that dyslexic people suffer from is the ability to read, or to be more accurate, to read in the same way that non-dyslexic people do. Now, I'm only an expert on my own experience with this, so I won't speak for anybody else, but one of the things that I think it's important to point out is that there are a number of dyslexic actors in the world. You've probably heard of them. Tom Cruise is one, Judi Dench is one, Chris Tucker is one. There are many, many different dyslexic actors. The point with that is they just work in a slightly different way. The way that dyslexic brains work and process words and letters is slightly different. Now I have an example here. Now we're just going to hold this up to the camera and then I'm going to pass it around. For me, this is more or less what a
not
big
coming
block of
up.
text would look like. What?
No, it's just it didn't come on screen.
Oh, well no, I was doing it for the recording. Yeah, I can do that as well.
Oh, sorry.
Did you get that?
It's not on the camera, it's on the screensaver.
Here we go.
Coming up. Oh,
It is quite small. I'll pass this around anyway. If you can work out exactly where this text is, it's quite a famous one. But that is basically what a block of text would look like to my brain on a bad day. Yeah, exactly. It looks like one long, unbroken hashtag with no capitals, no punctuation, nothing. So, how do I deal with that? Generally, what? Well, fortunately, I'm not the type of dyslexic that sometimes we do actually use tinted glasses, because sometimes it's literally the contrast of the page to the text that is the problem. Like I know a lot of people sometimes print their text out on coloured paper or use tinted glasses in order to cut that problem down. The thing that tends to work better for me is I will, especially if I'm reading it off of a screen, I will highlight a piece of text so that it stands out from the rest of the body of text and go through like that. Sometimes I know that people will highlight in different colours to indicate different characters or different accents or what have you. But what I also do is just, sometimes it's as simple as making the text bigger. Because as you see with that, it's a case of not being able to distinguish one word or one letter from another. So it's like, it's not that I don't see the words, it's I don't see the gaps between the words. Like one thing that I've made an amusing joke over the years that sometimes when there are compound words, my brain breaks them up into different compound words. Like for example, I can't read the word co-workers without somehow my brain translating it into cow-walkers. I don't know what a cow-walker is. I don't know what they do. Maybe they're like going around putting horned helmets on cows, I don't know. Or like painting them green.
Thank God you're not in Germany using the German language.
Yeah.
Most of our words are compounds.
Yeah, exactly. But it would be interesting to talk to you afterwards about how you tend to break down a word so that it makes sense. Because obviously, yeah, it's a compound word that is the thing of a thing of a thing of a thing with a thing. But no, with being dyslexic, the way that I tend to approach the practicalities of that is sometimes it is, like I say, just making the text bigger. I wonder how many people who buy like big or large print versions of books are doing it because they are visually impaired in some way, or because they just find it easier to read. I don't have the answer to that. Maybe somebody else does.
I don't have the answer, but also there are dyslexic-friendly fonts you can use.
Yes, yes, those also help. Again, your mileage may vary with them. I have found some that are easier than others, but I find that generally it's more the size than the actual shape of the letters that is the issue a lot of the time.
Bizarrely, just to add
Yeah.
to what David was saying as well, speaking from the point of view of somebody who works for the library service, bizarrely, once you reach the end of your teenage years, you're suddenly cured of dyslexia.
Yeah.
Because dyslexia-friendly books are either children's books or teen books.
Yeah.
They stop for adults. They just don't do them.
There's a bookshop in Sweden near Bristol that's got a project to try and publish adult dyslexia friendly
Yeah,
books.
it's something that should be done because it is exactly, and lots of people.
There's a good point here to be made actually about how dyslexia is a learning difficulty, like so many other learning difficulties, are named and kind of defined not by what it causes the individual who has it as a problem, but by the problems it causes for the adults and the caregivers around that individual.
Just a point, how old was you when you discovered that you were struggling?
Well, I was about 7 when my parents came to a parents' evening at my school, and the teacher sat down with them and said, "We've got problems." And my mum at the time said, "Well, thank you. Thank you for at least noticing. Thank you for at least just," because up to that point, they had just kind of assumed I was slow, or I didn't get it. I wasn't thinking like, oh, he'll catch up eventually, but you know, for the moment, it's not very good. Like he can barely read or write his name. And I did get assessed at that point. I went to an assessment centre, and yeah, they were fairly certain I had dyslexia and dyspraxia actually, but that's out of the remit of this talk today. But then later on, just as I was finishing drama school, having been told all my life, yeah, you have dyslexia, this is a thing, they wanted me to go back and get assessed again as an adult, because time had passed by that point, about 15 years or so. So sometimes they were saying, well, the thing that you get diagnosed with when you're 7 sometimes manifests in a different way later on, and sometimes it's misdiagnosed. There are plenty of people who get misdiagnosed with a thing when they're young because it presents in a certain way, and actually, as time goes by and as the sphere of knowledge increases, you find out it's something else. So I went back and I got reassessed when I was about 23, 24. And they did say, yeah, no, you have, you definitely do have dyslexia, and it's the type that isn't caused by just bad teaching. Because there is apparently a form of it that is just caused by being improperly taught. And that kind of brings me on to the point of, again, I'm probably preaching to the converted in a room like this, but the way that we teach things needs to be geared more towards the individual rather than the individual having to mould themselves to the way that it's being taught. Because a lot of the way, and again, throughout all of drama school I ran into this as well, the way that certain brains assimilate information varies. And that's all really any learning difficulty or neurological disorder is. Your brain works in a non-standard way. So you have to figure out what works for you. And bringing it back to the voice acting, the methodology by which we produce the audiobooks is that of a typical project, the way that it will work is this. If I have an audiobook to do, I will do it chapter by chapter. I will record a chapter, do a first pass edit, which basically is taking out all of the stops, pauses, mistakes that I can find, and then I will send that off to one of my colleagues, usually Mark or Tracy, and they will look at it with, or they will listen to it rather, with the text in front of them. They'll then make a note of any inconsistency with what I've said and what is in the text. I can go back and re-record those and drop them into the final product. Now, in a perfect world, that's where it would end, because we'd then have a fully finished thing. Sometimes it can take a few iterations back and forth, but usually that's how it works. And generally speaking, like we have a system now where there's like a spreadsheet we have. So like I will go, okay, so at this time index there was this thing, I said A rather than Z, so I'll go back and I'll re-record that. And then we do this whole process through the book, chapter by chapter, and finally at the end there is a third listen through, so the person who has been second pass editing it hands it over to the other person who hasn't heard any of it yet, and they will listen through for the final time to make sure that the thing A makes sense, is consistent with the text, you know, does all of the things we've been talking about in terms of the technique that is involved. So like there'll be moments where it's like, didn't understand that bit. It's all perfectly plain English, but what actually is being put across here? We can highlight stuff like that. And then it's mastered and given a final pass, and hopefully then unleashed upon the world.
So you get by with help from your cow walkers.
We are cow walkers. Yeah.
Sorry.
That's one t-shirt.
You're going to start a new term now. aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I should point out that this one here is the microphone that pretty much everything up to, I think it was the Corsio contracts that I've done for Circle of Spears, I recorded on that mic. So it's storied, that one. So yeah, summing up what I was talking about. Voice acting is acting, ultimately. And occasionally it means that you get to have more interesting hair. The techniques that you develop whilst being a voice actor are things that can apply across the board in every form of acting. Because I'm sure you can appreciate that if you're looking at a script from that point of view in terms of looking at the distinctions, comparisons, repetitions, all of that with any kind of text you're presented with, that will inform how you're putting across any kind of text in any medium. The only thing really that is the key thing to remember with voice acting is that you are trying to work in harmony with the technology that is part of your job. In much the same way as there are various different techniques for acting to camera, it's all, at the end of the day, I suppose the under the bonnet kind of stuff that allows you to do what it is you do. You're always acting. It's like the techniques of acting are the same. It's just the technicalities of working with what you're working with. So, for example, when I'm talking to a mic, I'm having to imagine that the person that is listening to it is on the other end of that mic. And I'm a voice in their head. I'm taking them on a journey, and I'm doing so using that mic. It's merely the medium, it's not what's actually the message, if you see what I mean. And I think at this moment I'm going to open it up to any questions. I will your cues. Okay, we have one over here.
I'd like to say thank you. You've clarified 1 or 2 points for me.
Oh, good.
I've been, in the past, I've worked with the Plymouth Who Productions, which is audio stories. You can find them on Facebook. I'd never done it before when I started, but they gave very brief directions of how to play the part. So I had 2 pages of script for my part, and I first had to establish myself as a very calm, controlled character. And by the time I got to the end of the 2nd page, I was in a panic, but I had to stay in control.
Yeah.
That's all they said. Now, I can see what you said, you've got to be intense.
Yeah.
That's clarified something for me that was worrying, because I never knew if I'd done it right.
Yeah, and often that's a good example of the director presumably told you to play it that way, right?
Yes.
So the director's going to be thinking about what's right for the scene and what gets the characters and the story across.
Yeah.
Whereas you as the actor and the performer are also having to think about like the technicalities of using the microphone to your best advantage.
Yes.
And yeah, it's a lot to keep in your head all at once.
Especially if you've never done it before.
Especially if you know, like it's a tremendous learning curve. Like one of the things actually that we were always taught to start with is you practice by just recording yourself, listening back. Now I know a lot of people, probably everyone in here, has had the absolute abject horror of listening to their voice recorded, right? And you go, oh God, do I really sound like that? Yes, you do. Because we always hear our own voice from a perspective that nobody else can.
Yes.
I.e., inside our own head, it's resonating in a way that nobody else hears it. It's got to the point now where, even though there is a distinction between what I hear when I speak and what I hear when I play back a recording, I've got to the point where I know that if I change how I'm speaking to me, or how it sounds to me, it will translate into how I sound to everyone else. And that is just hours and hours and hours of practicing, listening back to myself, figuring out like what did and didn't work in certain places, and trying to apply that going forwards. It's why they say it doesn't matter what kind of mic you've got. And yeah, okay. A point about that. Yes, it doesn't matter what kind of mic you've got, especially if you're just starting out. Although, like with any professional, the tools you are using will determine to a certain extent how easy it is to do your job. And so, like, that mic there was a fantastic starter mic. There were some issues with it that we ultimately got over. Like, for example, if myself and Mark and Tracy were recording in isolation, but we were all going to be part of the same production, we needed to make very, very sure that the mics we were using sounded consistent to each other. Otherwise, it sounds like we're in a different room, or the quality between the two mics is noticeable. It's not that necessarily even that one is bad and one is good, it's that the quality of the sound is different enough, it's noticeable. And that's another thing that will just take an audience out of the moment. If you're noticing that there is a slight difference in audio quality between two characters, it's kind of like the equivalent in film terms of seeing a boom shadow, or seeing like a tiny bit of the set that you're not supposed to see, or a crew member somewhere. It's noticeable for all of the wrong reasons. Yes?
If you're re-recording something later to pop it in to correct a mistake, let's say, how do you ensure that the sound quality is the same?
Okay.
Given that the atmosphere could be warmer,
yes,
you could be more tired or whatever.
This is absolutely a good point, and the way that I do it is genuinely, I have on my desk a, like, I've placed the mic there, and I have drawn a circle around it. I've drawn for that one specifically, I actually drew a circle around where each of the little legs went, so that the mic is in exactly the same position every single time I set it up. That's one thing, because even like just a slight, like, degree or so off can do it. The atmospheric quality and whatnot, that tends to be something you can deal with when you are mastering it. Usually, if there is a bit of like room ambience that is there at one point that wasn't there before, that's generally why when we do any kind of recording, like one of the main things we do when I'm doing my podcast recording is at the beginning of it, we'll both like say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and clap to sync all of the audios together, and then there'll be about 5 seconds of silence, because we're then getting the room ambience, and that we can just drop in wherever we need to if there's a moment where we need to do it. You'll probably seen a similar thing to this happening on film shoots and whatnot. Exactly the same principle is that you're getting the ambience of a room. You can then take that and make it consistent across whatever piece that you're doing.
So what we're doing, I'm in the choir, been in the choir since 2017, pretty much chorus. I'm also slightly dyslexic as well, so I understand exactly where you're coming from. But we've got, I find it also awkward to be in front of people when I'm singing in the choir, because that's not something we used to do. I have been on the stage with the choir, which is quite an experience in itself, a proper stage. And we have signed an extra cathedral, and that obviously is quite an experience for 50 other singers.
Oh yeah, sure.
At the time, that was 2019, before the pandemic hit. And what we're doing now is this Monday coming, we have to do a recording of one of the Christmas songs that we've been rehearsing, so that they can play it at Exeter Carnival, because we're in the Carnival this year. And so tomorrow we've got to, everything you just said about sound, we've got to do the whole lot in one go. Then he's got to do, and we've done the tracking bit before, then he's got to do each separate, so especially recorded, each separate piece, like the altos, the soprano, now so like that, the basses, they all get done separately afterwards, and mixed together.
And often the reason why they do that is specifically so that they can keep every element of it consistent. But I know that there have been some famous examples in music of people using the inconsistencies in their voice to an advantage. Like I know, for example, that on the Beatles song Twist and Shout, they waited deliberately until the end of a 12-hour recording day to record that, so that his voice was actually ragged and rough, because that's what suited the song. Did we have another question over here?
Yes, I wanted to ask, is there any truth? Because I mean, obviously I've had a bit of speech therapy, and I think I heard it from her, but I've heard it from somewhere else. That, and it may be something that's already come up, but if you put your hands behind your ears like that, then when you speak, that's the closest to what your actual voice sounds like to someone else present to you.
Does it? Well, I guess, in a way.
I don't know if it's true, I just wondered whether it was...
Well, I'm doing it now, and I'm possibly not the person really to be asking this, because honestly, it's got to the point now where if I'm hearing my own recorded voice, I'm not even seeing the distinction anymore between how I just sound naturally to me.
I didn't know whether it was something you had done or something you knew about, whether it was just hearsay. I didn't know whether, that's why I was asking whether there was any, you come across.
Maybe the audience at large can try that and decide for themselves. And so yeah, we have a question here.
Yeah, when you were doing the angry, be angrier but don't be louder.
Yeah.
You let people demonstrate, please, how you can be angrier without being louder.
Sure, okay. So if we're using the I'm angry thing, you start off possibly with, I'll say it first just flat, and then hopefully you'll see what I mean. So, I'm angry. I'm angry. I'm angry. So you're changing the delivery subtly.
The enunciation, isn't it?
But yeah,
Slowing
yeah.
it even, yeah.
Slowing it was a choice I made, but it's more like the reason I made that choice was it hopefully gets the intensity of the emotion across without having to raise the pitch or lower it. Like again, another good example for that would be if you are in a situation where you do need to be shouting, then usually you'll just have to tweak the settings a little bit so that the pickup is lower. So if you are having to like shout your head off as part of a scene, like maybe you're doing a part in like the latest Call of Duty thing, and you've got to be shouting "Grenade, get down!" or something like that. Usually you'll be working with either a sound engineer who will be setting the level for you, and that's another thing that you'll generally do as part of a rehearsal for something. Is there's a term we'll use called setting the level, whereby you go through exactly what you're going to do for the scene before they record it, and you do it at the level that you're going to do it for the scene. And usually the sound engineer will like bump it up a little bit because they know that on the night, so to speak, you're going to be giving it a little bit more than you do in rehearsal. But generally speaking, you set a level so that they know, all right, that's about the intensity we're going for here. And we can set the settings accordingly so that it doesn't peak the mic and doesn't sound like you're too close or too far away or anything like that. It's a way to, again, keep the audio quality consistent and keep the audience hopefully in the story, not worrying, oh God, what was that? Anyway, we had a question over here.
I once talked to a voice actor who said that the worst job he had was an advert when he had to say the phrase rather, burglar alarm several times because he kept tripping over. I wondered what's your worst phrase or thing that you
There was an interesting incident, and I'm setting myself up for a fall here, but I stumbled over the word anaesthetist. I don't even know why or what the context of it was, but I know it was for one of the audiobooks we were doing, and I couldn't get it right for like about 3 days. And it wasn't that the word even was indistinct. It was I just got that phenomena where if you say a word 20 times, it starts to sound like nonsense.
Yeah.
It stops sounding like speech or like language. It's just noise. And basically I just had to go away for a moment, enunciate it very slowly and carefully, and then come back. But yeah, every actor probably has had a story like that. And one of the things actually that a lot of them do as a flex is, as part of a vocal warm-up a lot of the time, we'll do tongue twisters and things like that. In fact, I remember there was a thing we used to do at my drama school, which was, we'd make a drinking game out of it. We literally would be sat in the bar going, right, she sat upon the balustrade balcony, inexplicably mimicking him, hiccuping and amicably welcoming him in. Drink. She sat upon the balustrade balcony, inexplicably mimicking him, hiccuping and amicably welcoming him in. Drink. Etc.
I know Stephen Fry's story about that which was
Harry pocketed it.
Harry pocketed it.
Yeah.
He was doing the audiobooks for Harry Potter. He couldn't say this phrase at all. He left it till the end.
Yeah.
He tried Harry Potter, he couldn't do it. And when he was doing the explanation, he couldn't say it either.
Yeah.
So he rang up J.K. Rowling and said, do you mind if we change the line? He put it in his pocket, for example.
Yeah.
And she said no. So eventually he tried and got it to work.
Yeah.
He the audiobook.
And then she put that same phrase in every subsequent. There's also some instances we've had where, talking about what you were saying before about there being typos or spelling mistakes or whatnot, sometimes, very occasionally, we've had instances where you'll get a piece of text that actually just manifestly does not make sense. Like there is a word missing, or there is a clause that's out of whack somehow, and if you read it literally as written, it doesn't make any sense. And usually at that moment you have to either make a context guess, because sometimes it's really, really obvious if there is just a word missing. But otherwise, you do actually have to either go to, more often, the director, or if you have them on hand, which you don't always, the author themselves, and say, all right, this is what it literally says. What did you actually mean? That's very, very rare, but it does happen.
I've got the reverse side of that story.
Yeah.
Because I've had one of my books read by Sanford Spears Tracy, who did a fantastic job. And when we were sort of negotiating to start the process, I said, look, if you spot a typo, please let me know, because I can correct the book. And you were very, no, it must be the text, it must be precisely what you've written down. And I was like, it's easy to say it in a different way, just do that. So I wonder what your opinion of
well, generally
changing
speaking,
the
as a
text.
rule, even though this is not actually literally the case all of the time, as an actor you have to treat every bit of text you get as like, this is the 6th version of it, it has been slaved over, it has been, knocked about every which way, and the writer has made the decision to say those words in that particular order for a reason. Even if you don't understand what that reason is, say it, or make it make sense. Now, as you just pointed out, sometimes that's not the case, but generally as a voice actor you don't know that. And so if you start improvising or paraphrasing around the text, you can lead yourself into all sorts of problems in terms of what the intended meaning of something was versus what actually comes across. Yes?
And having worked not with Circle of Spears but as a freelancer with an author for whom I was providing a free editing service because she was rewriting the books as I recorded them. So I recorded what she'd written, she listened to it, rewrote everything, and then I had to record a new thing. And sometimes she would then rewrite it again.
Did you get paid for that?
I got paid very, very well, and I did 3 books for her.
I should bloody well hope so.
But
Because yeah, that is another thing actually.
It was a hellish process.
I only want to be on the high note from it. How do you cope with the he said, she said? Because sometimes it's very clear by the layout of the page that you've changed speaker.
Yeah.
But on an audio, you don't have the paragraph.
No, I mean, a lot of the time the distinction will come from if you're giving the characters 2 distinct modes of speaking. And that's another thing that actually, surprisingly, I wouldn't say the majority of authors I've worked with, but a decent number of them, when they have written it, don't seem to have given much thought to how their characters actually sound. Like, even if they are reading the text aloud, which you should, definitely, if ever you're intending to do any kind of creative writing, read it aloud. What sounds good in your head doesn't always necessarily sound good aloud. But, in terms of making the text make sense, generally it's always better to, again, make a decision about how a particular character sounds. If they have two distinct modes of speaking, that is a way, obviously, of in the audio medium doing it. Generally, the he said, she said, or they exclaimed, he ejaculated, he, you know, it turns up so much in like about pre-1900 written word. Clearly it had a slightly different connotation then. But in terms of making sure that the audience know which characters are distinct, that is, well, the he said, she said is there to help, but also it can kind of become a bit peripheral if actually they sound distinct from each other, and they should, ideally. If you have any two characters or more in a scene, they should all sound distinct enough from each other, even if they're being performed by the same person, that you can go, oh, it's that person, it's that person. In fact, one of the things that Tracy and I did on a recent project that we did was the narrator shifts at one point in the story. So the actual narrating character changes. But they're all the same characters that are being talked about. So we had a shared document whereby when a new character arrived, I would make a note of who that character is, what kind of accent they have, what they sound like, where the placing in the mouth is, so that when Tracy came to do those characters that I had done the first half of the book for and she was doing the second, we were both singing from the same hymn sheet, as it were. We knew what every character should and does sound like, so that it was easy to keep that consistency over the whole piece. Yes? I think you were first, but I saw you. Yeah.
You just loosely mentioned it, or someone's mentioned it, is how is pay for such things worked out? Is it, is it by individual contract? Is it like a contract for so many items?
Well,
is it piecework because you've done so many words per minute? Or?
Generally, the way that a lot of freelance stuff will work is they will either give you a royalty share on the sales of the final product, or they will pay you per finished hour. So it's a rate of X per finished hour. Generally speaking, as a freelancer, I will say that my rate is X per finished hour or part thereof. So it's always going to cost at least X, but that is the rate going forward. Voice acting, generally, if you can make it pay, is decent, but like with pretty much every other part of the acting industry, it's boom and bust, feast and famine. Your question?
When you don't have a recording studio, just do it at home, say for a podcast, or you want to have a soundtrack for your video you made for YouTube. I heard that it sounds better if you sort of have like a box you speak into.
In fact, I'll demonstrate, because I have a picture of it here on my phone, what my recording setup looks like. This was partially built by my dad from reclaimed building materials, but as you can see, I don't think I can, I'll just come around with it. That is my recording box there. It's basically a three-sided box with a microphone in the middle, with a screen behind it.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's roughly a metre square.
Okay, you need space for that.
Yeah, you don't need something exactly like this. I know plenty of people who do it with duvet and cushions. Like they literally just put something. The important thing to have is make sure that there's not a space behind that it can reverberate off, and you're just trying to deaden the sound so that what you've got is a space that is as neutral as possible in terms of the amount of reverberation and room ambient you can get.
I've heard of one person who suggested and recommended you get a garden umbrella, put that over the top of you, and then throw a blanket over it. So you're in a tent, basically.
Yeah. Pardon all the D20s, it's a D&D podcast. But yeah, that is basically my setup. And there are like no two home setups are going to be exactly the same. I know that there are some people that have like an entire booth that they step into, which is very swish. There are some people who just do it with pillows and duvets. Again, you're just trying to make an area that's kind of deadened, so that you have a consistency of room tone and not any echo or anything like that. We've got a question at the back here?
Yeah, how much harder is it to get into character when you haven't got a theatre group or a stage around you and you're just coming to a microphone?
Interesting question. That does sort of touch on what I was saying earlier about the distinctions, comparisons, repetitions. That's a thing that should inform the character. But in terms of getting into character when you are just by yourself in a room, it can be difficult. And again, usually that's where you'd lean a little bit more on your director or anyone else who is subsequently going to be listening to what you're doing. So you've got to make a decision and play that as truthfully as possible. If it turns out that's not quite what fits, you can always go back and change it. But the point is that you've got to make a decision about how you're going to play a certain scene. So staying in character is more a case of just doing the acting work of, all right, well, my character is in this situation, they know this, they don't know that. This is how they feel about the situation they're in, and then just let the text get the rest across. If it's wrong, or if it doesn't fit more accurately, then that's something you can go back and address. But the main point is making a decision, staying with it. Are we about?
Yeah, just one very good thing.
Sure, yeah, okay.
We'll take one more.
Yeah, we'll take one more question.
Yeah, it's actually not a question, it's more of a remark. I find it quite interesting what you said about sounding different to the outside people than you actually feel like you when you hear yourself.
Yeah.
I had an experience. I was working in London and I was recording telephone messages in German and in English for the company I was working for, and then playing the messages back.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that you actually, first of all, it's very strange to hear yourself, because it sounds different. And secondly, I thought it was very strange that I sounded different in the two languages. I sounded different in German, and then I sounded in English. And sort of my reasoning, because when I sort of listened back to it and I realised it's the actual language itself.
Yes, languages have a cadence. It's why often certain American actors struggle with Shakespeare and the iambic pentameter of it, is because it's still more or less the natural way an English person will speak, the rhythm in which they will speak. Whereas for a lot of other languages, and even just American English, it isn't anymore. Which is fascinating when you consider that actually their root is a more archaic version of the English that Shakespeare would have been closer to. But yeah, the natural cadence of certain languages is different. So you are going to sound differently. Also, another factor in that would have been telephones compress audio so that it's easier to send them long distances. Has been since the beginning of telephones. And that's why generally they're never used as recording devices if you can avoid it.
Wouldn't recommend.
Yes. Any other questions, please come and find me. I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.